Good afternoon, colleagues, and welcome back to this specially recalled sitting of Parliament. Before we move to the substantive matters for discussion, the first item of business is consideration of Business Motion 23816 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau on suspension of standing orders. Could I call on the Minister to move the motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. No member has indicated they wish to speak on the motion. Therefore, the question is that motion 23816 be agreed. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you. We now turn to our debate on motion 23815 in the name of the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon on trade and cooperation agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union. Could I invite all members who wish to contribute to this debate to press their request to speak buttons, and I call on the First Minister Nicola Sturgeon to speak to and to move the motion.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today, the SNP and I hope Parliament will vote on principle. We will vote against a rotten Brexit that Scotland has rejected all along, and will say no to a hard Brexit deal that damages our economy, our society and the opportunities of this and future generations. I'll say more on that shortly, but first let me issue a challenge to Tory MSPs who say we should be backing this deal. If you support this deal, then set out for us today, in clear and simple terms, what the benefits of it to Scotland actually are. And then tell us how it comes close, even close, to honouring Scotland's choices. Now, my prediction is that the Tories will do none of that today, because quite simply, they can't. Far from respecting Scotland's democratic wishes, this deal rides roughshod over them. And compared to EU membership, it has no benefits, only massive downsides. And to the eternal shame of the Tories, it even betrays wholesale the promises made to Scotland's fishermen. So bereft of any positive case, what we'll hear instead today is desperate diversionary nonsense. They'll say that we have to back this deal, not because it's any good, Presiding Officer, but because the alternative is worse. That, frankly, is an insult to Scotland's intelligence. It's legally suspect for a start, but more to the point, as we will see very shortly, this deal will pass regardless of how Scotland's MPs vote, because that's what the Westminster establishment has decided. The fact is, Scotland's voice has been ignored on Brexit all along, every single step of the way. But you know, the real disgrace of the Tory position is the notion that lies at the heart of it, that the best Scotland can ever hope for is a choice between a terrible outcome and an even worse outcome. Well, the bad news for them is that, just like Brexit itself, that's a notion people in Scotland are increasingly rejecting. More and more people are realising that we can do better. We do not have to accept whatever dismal future Tories decide to foist upon us. We can choose our own future instead. It is time, Mr Rumbles, for Scotland to get the best possible deal, and that's a future as an independent European nation.
Mike Rumbles.
I believe, like the First Minister, that ending a political and economic union of some 48 years will be poorer for us in Scotland. But, well, it will be. It will be poorer for us. Do you not realise that? But does she not understand? Can the First Minister not see that the same argument she uses stands, the very same arguments stand for ending a 300-year-old economic and political union?
First Minister.
The European Union is made up of independent nations, and the dismal Liberal position is this. They know how damaging, how devastating Brexit is for Scotland, but they think we should just have to put up with it rather than choose a better future for ourselves. Well, we have no truck with that. Scotland can, should aspire to be an equal independent country, and that is what Scotland is on the path to becoming. Presiding Officer, 62% of people in Scotland voted to stay in the European Union. In not one but two subsequent UK general elections, pro-EU parties got an overwhelming majority of votes in Scotland. And these votes reflect the economic and practical benefits that EU membership has brought to our country. But they also reflect something more fundamental. People in Scotland, by and large, and for all its imperfections, support what the EU represents. Its fundamental principle that independent nations should share sovereignty for the common good is one that most people support. Its values, democracy, equality, solidarity, the rule of law, respect for human rights are ones we share. And throughout this whole Brexit process, we have all seen, and I suspect most people will long remember, the stark contrast between the EU's solidarity with Ireland and the UK government's utter contempt for Scotland and her people. The fact is, there is no Brexit settlement that would ever fulfil the wishes of people in Scotland. But there were outcomes that would have protected our interests better than this one. Back in December 2016, the Scottish Government published a plan for compromise. We recognised, reluctantly, that the UK would leave the EU, but proposed staying in the single market and customs union. It was the obvious compromise position, but the UK Government dismissed it out of hand. They disregarded Scotland's views, values and interests. And now they have agreed a deal that is disastrous for Scotland. A deal that puts barriers in the way of Scotland's exports. You know, the Tories are trumpeting, pun intended, the fact that this deal delivers zero tariffs, as if we're all meant to suddenly forget that there were already no tariffs. But now, to avoid tariffs in the future, businesses will need to meet a whole host of complex regulatory requirements. The estimated cost of all of that to business in the UK is £7 billion every year. Service providers could now face different restrictions in each EU country. The finance sector, almost 10% of Scotland's economy, is still completely in the dark about what will replace the all-important passport. Ordinary people will pay a price even for simple family holidays, new health insurance requirements, roaming charges for mobile phones, more time-consuming queues at airports. There are consequences too for our justice system. Our police will no longer have real-time, immediate access to alerts from EU partners on wanted or missing persons. And as well as making us less safe, this deal also makes us less free. The right to work, study and live across an entire continent is being taken away. And it will also be far more difficult for us to attract workers from other EU countries. One of our key challenges as a country, an ageing and potentially shrinking population, has just been made even worse. These costs, these harms, for that is what they are real, and they start taking effect in just 2 days' time. They will cost jobs and they will reduce prosperity in Scotland. And the benefits, well, perhaps I'll get some of the benefits in a moment.
Dean Lockhart.
Well, from tomorrow, we'll be able to enter into free trade agreements with countries across the rest of the world. And over the past 15 years, the SNP has voted against every free trade agreement that it's voted on, including free trade agreements with Singapore, with Canada and Japan. So if you're so concerned about free trade, why did the SNP vote against all of those free trade agreements?
First Minister.
None of these free trade agreements will make up for membership of the world's biggest single market that in 2 days' time we get ripped out of against our will. The member has just helpfully demonstrated that the benefits in return for all of this harm being imposed on us are pretty much non-existent. Even fishing, the one sector that did expect benefits from Brexit, has been comprehensively let down. The Tory fishing promises were never deliverable. Many of us pointed that out, but they were made and the industry had a right to rely on them. Every single one of them have been broken. Douglas Ross, Alistair Jack, every Scottish Tory MP said in writing that the UK and Scotland must have complete control and full sovereignty over waters. They said that tying fisheries access to a trade deal was a red line that must not be crossed. If it was, they said, the UK would be leaving the common fisheries policy, I quote, in name only, and that in their words, not mine, that would be a betrayal of Scotland. Well, that betrayal is there for all to see in this deal. A long-term arrangement guaranteeing EU boats access to UK waters, access and quota shares included in the future economic partnership, access to waters not just tied to the overall trade deal, hardwired into it. Every single Tory promise to Scotland's fishermen broken, every Tory red line crossed. But you know, it's even worse than that. I think it's better the Tories listen to the reality of their sellout of fishing. The key whitefish stocks that so much of the Scottish industry depends on, for them there will be fewer fishing opportunities for Scotland under this deal than under the Common Fisheries Policy. Presiding Officer, this must be the worst negotiating outcome in history. A hard Brexit for Scotland and a comprehensive sellout of the Scottish fishing industry. That's why the verdicts of fishermen themselves are so damning. The National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations, fishing has been sacrificed. The Scottish Whitefish Producers Association, deeply aggrieved. The Scottish Fishermen's Federation, the deal does not restore sovereign UK control over fisheries. The UK is, I quote them, now a coastal state with one hand tied behind our back. Utterly damning, but utterly justified. The fishing industry, misled by the Tories, sold out by the Tories all over again. Betrayed by the Tories on the way into the EU, betrayed by the Tories on the way out. And it's part of a pattern. Not that long ago, Ruth Davidson made it known that she would resign rather than support a differential deal for Northern Ireland. It's amazing what the offer of a place in the House of Lords can do to the merest whiff of a Ruth Davidson principle. Adam Tompkins, I'm not sure if he's here, went even further. No unionist, he said, could ever endorse any sort of differentiated deal for Northern Ireland, but that's what this deal delivers. A hard Brexit for Scotland and a special single market deal for Northern Ireland. They're even dragging us out of Erasmus, a truly wonderful horizon-expanding scheme that gives young people opportunities to live and study across Europe. And again, the Tories here told us that wouldn't happen. Erasmus is something which all parties agree must continue post-Brexit. The words of Jackson Carlaw. But the UK government has now turned its back on Erasmus and sold out our young people as well. And Jackson Carlaw, not a peep. I can only assume that his ermine cloak is in the post. Presiding Officer, what is now very clear is this. The Scottish Tories are ignored by their Westminster bosses, just like Scotland as a whole is. But they lack the gumption or the self-respect to do anything about it. They are Boris Johnson's mouthpiece. They will abandon any principle, break any promise, sell out any sector if Westminster and Boris Johnson tell them to. Today is conclusive proof of that. By contrast, and in conclusion, Presiding Officer, the SNP today will stick by our principles, by our values and by our beliefs. And most importantly, we will stick by the people of Scotland who have opposed Brexit at every turn. We will not play the Westminster game. We refuse to be complicit in a Boris Johnson-imposed democratic, social and economic calamity for Scotland. The people of Scotland have been ignored throughout this whole fiasco, our views disregarded, our Parliament treated with contempt. For Scotland, we now know beyond doubt that the Westminster system is broken beyond repair. We deserve better than a dismal choice between a terrible deal and no deal. We deserve the right to choose the best deal of all, a future as an independent European country. It is only through independence that we will ever get to choose the future we want. Independence, that is the deal that so many people in Scotland now do want, and we will have the right to choose it. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you. I call Ruth Davidson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This week's vote is not about EU membership. The United Kingdom hasn't been a member of the EU since the 31st of January. We've already left and there's no going back. The only options on the table are the deal or no deal. And if you vote against the first one, then you're inescapably voting for the second one. And all but the dimmest and blindest SNP loyalists can see that. Presiding Officer, in 10 years as an MSP, I don't think I've ever quoted Wings Over Scotland. And I'm not sure which one of us will be more surprised that I've done so now. But that is a pretty succinct summation of where we are. Because this isn't about overturning the referendum or refighting the arguments of the past or some mythical other deal that's just over the next hill. And the facts aren't dependent on which way you voted. Leave or remain, it is undisputedly true that we ceased to be a member of the European Union 11 months ago, and a transition period was put in place that will end by law tomorrow. Those are the facts on the ground. They are the realities against which today's debate is taking place, and they are the backdrop against which a legislative consent motion is being requested. They also provide the context within which the SNP's contortions over the last 48 hours need to be judged. Because they would have us all believe that this is a matter of principle for them, that they are only acting in Scotland's interest, but the truth is the exact opposite. They are acting in their own narrow, nationalist self-interest by voting today against the very thing that they have spent months demanding to be delivered, an EU trade deal. A trade deal that the SNP demanded is on the table, negotiated by the UK and the EU, supported by the President of the EU Commission and the European Council, formally approved by the EU ambassadors, and will only come into effect if it is passed by the Parliament on these shores. And if this deal isn't voted for, the UK will leave without a deal, because there is no other option. So let's see what Nicola Sturgeon thinks of no deal, shall we? Leaving the European Union with no deal would be devastating for the Scottish economy. It looks as if the UK could leave without a deal, and that would be catastrophic. No deal should simply not be allowed to happen. The Prime Minister has set the UK on an almost inevitable course to no deal. This position that it has taken makes it very difficult to see how a deal can be struck with the EU, and I think that would be catastrophic for Scotland. In reality, he is pursuing... I'll wait till I finish reading this Nicola Sturgeon before I hear from this Nicola Sturgeon, so give me a moment. In reality, he's really pursuing a no-deal Brexit, and I think that is extremely dangerous for Scotland, indeed for the whole of the UK. We know the work that we've done on the impact that would have on jobs, on the economy, on our university, and on almost every aspect of society in Scotland. I think it incumbent on all of us who think that this is the wrong outcome to do everything we possibly can to block it. I, the Scottish Government, the SNP, will work with others to do everything we can to block his plan for a no-deal Brexit, which would do catastrophic harm from Scotland. And on Christmas Eve, less than a week ago, a deal is better than no deal. On you go.
First Minister.
Firstly, it's no wonder the European Commission President backs this. The EU got everything they wanted out of it. Secondly, no deal's not on the table today, as we will find out shortly. But in case Ruth Davidson is going to forget to talk about fishing, I wonder if she can tell us how this came about. And I'm about to quote Mike Park, Chief Executive of the Scottish Whitefish Producers Association, and I'm quoting now: "The deal we've been dealt gives us less fish than it did before." Can Ruth Davidson, having made all these promises to our fishermen, explain to us how exactly did that come about?
Ruth Davidson.
Not only does Scotland's fishing fleet get more fish over time, we become an independent coastal state, we also get access to fish processors to market, which is exactly what she asked for. So let's be clear. She is voting, and not on this one, she is voting for no deal. And let's be clear what voting against this deal would do. To vote against this deal, you wanted answers on what this is going to do for the UK, so I'm giving you them. To vote against this deal is to vote against zero trade, zero tariffs, to vote against deep security intelligence cooperation, never before offered by the EU in such an agreement. It's voting against participation in science, in research and space programmes. It is voting against agreements for airlines and hauliers. It is voting against securing access to our fishermen to market for their products. And it is voting against recognition for geographical indicators like Scotch witchy, like Stornoway black pudding and like Arbroath smokies. So if the First Minister can tell us why she hates Arbroath smokies so much, she can go right ahead. Why do you hate the smokies?
First Minister.
Firstly, every single thing that Ruth Davidson has just listed there, we had as members of the European Union. All of that we are losing to get a worse deal to try to retain some of it. But Ruth Davidson didn't respond. She said that the fishermen have more fish now. I quoted the Chief Executive of the Scottish Whitefish Producers Association: "The deal we've been dealt gives us less fish than before." She still hasn't explained how that could possibly have come about from a Tory party that promised the world to our fishermen. Will she do so now?
The fishing fleet will build up. It has 5 years to build up our fishing fleet. We'll become an independent coastal state and, crucially, has access to market.
Order.
But what the First Minister hasn't answered when she's talked about this is that this isn't about being in or out of the EU. What we're voting on today is about whether it's a deal or no deal. And she is marching her troops into the no-deal voting lobbies and giving all of this up. But let's listen to other third-party members here. Here's Scottish businesses' reaction to the deal. A positive reaction that, of course, counts for nothing with an SNP that is determined to grandstand and politic, as we have just seen. The Federation of Small Business says it is a huge relief to see negotiators finally strike a deal. The CBI says a huge relief for both the EU and UK economies. The NFU Scotland says it's good news. A deal has been done. No deal would have been no good for Scottish farming. And Tavish Scott, lately of this parish at the Scottish Salmon Producers Association, says, "We are pleased the negotiators have at last secured a deal. This will alleviate some of the serious problems that would come from a no-deal Brexit." All of Scotland's main business groups say back this deal to protect jobs and our national prosperity. But this SNP government says no. It says we'll vote against it anyway, and this feckless, useless SNP tribute act of Scottish Labour will fall in behind, even as Keir Starmer does the right thing. So how have we got here? How have we got here when Nicola Sturgeon said that her party, her government would do anything, they would work with anyone to get a deal? And when a deal is presented, when it's backed by the EU, by Scotland's businesses, when it will stop the very no deal that she says she wants to avoid at all costs, what does she do? She orders her troops into the Westminster lobbies, carrying the no deal Nicola banners high. Throughout this entire process, when it has come to the big calls, the SNP has asked one question of itself. Not what can be practically delivered, but how can Brexit be used to crank up grievance and promote the only thing that Nicola Sturgeon has ever cared about, independence. From backing an election that would deliver a pro-Brexit majority while driving a Stop Brexit bus, from striking down a withdrawal agreement 3 times that would deliver many of the provisions that they claim to want, then howling as that turned them into the handmaidens of something with no such provision, to talking up the catastrophe of no deal, even trying to pass a law banning it, to today trooping into the lobbies to vote for no deal. And it is because never once were they thinking about practical delivery, but always focused solely on their own narrow political game playing. And the truth is this, for the SNP this was never really about the substance of leaving the European Union, because they don't want to go there. This is, after all, the party that espouses separation from one union as a betrayal, but from another, deeper, more valuable one as a necessity. No, this has always solely been about weaponising the referendum result to widen the divisions on which they thrive. Today, they had the chance to show that they were prepared to change course, to expect the indisputable facts that the UK left the EU on the 31st of January and that tomorrow we leave the transitional arrangement. And today they had the chance to do the responsible thing and help lay a firm foundation for our new relationship with the EU. And instead, they're trying to take a sledgehammer to it. Instead, they're trying to scupper the only deal in town, carefully negotiated with the EU and unanimously approved by the ambassadors of all 27 EU member states and signed this morning by the presidents of the European Commission and the European Council. And their calculation is this: crank up the outrage, the grievance and the division, and hang the consequences. At the start of this month, Nicola Sturgeon said, "I very much hope that we will see a breakthrough in these talks, literally over the course of today. I think the UK government has to get real and really understand the implications for the NHS and across the economy if no deal is agreed." Get real. I think the First Minister needs to get real if she thinks she can stoke up grievance over no deal and then march her troops into the lobby today to vote for it, without people seeing it for exactly what it is. Once again, the SNP's own political games coming first. Hypocrisy. You couldn't mark Nicola Sturgeon's neck with a blowtorch. Presiding Officer, I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. And I call Richard Leonard to be followed by John McCarthy. Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me be clear at the outset. The Future Relationship Agreement Bill is a bad deal for Scotland. And I do not even think that many of the people who voted leave on the 23rd of June 2016 voted for this. Even on the Brexiteers' own terms, under this agreement, people will not take back control, they will lose it. It does not mean more democracy or more transparency, it means less. Boris Johnson promised that the UK, in his words, will prosper mightily, even with a no-deal Brexit. But the stark assessment of the government he leads flatly contradicts this. His own government now say national income per head will be 5% lower than it would have been if we were remaining in the EU, that we will be poorer. That's what the Johnson government themselves estimate, and that's an average. the distribution of that drop in income will not be evenly spread. And I claim no special insight, but I predict it will be the poorest who will be hit the hardest. I hope I'm wrong, but that's what experience teaches us. For businesses and workers, even entire industries, in just over a day's time, there will be new barriers, new frictions, bundles of new paperwork. There will be new costs, and it will be damaging. And it is a measure of the irresponsibility of the Johnson government that it is prepared to leave businesses and working people barely a week to adjust to these significant complexities and these new arrangements. A week. That's irresponsible government under any circumstances. But in the circumstances of the biggest economic recession for 300 years, in the middle of an economic shock and rising unemployment caused by a global pandemic, it is an abdication of responsibility without modern parallel. Yes.
Liz Smith.
I'm grateful to the member for giving way. Could he explain the difference in approach from Scottish Labour, from Sir Keir Starmer, who was very clear this morning that there is a choice on the table today? It's deal or no deal. Can he tell us why there is such a difference in the two approaches of Labour?
Richard Leonard.
There is not such a difference. The proposition before us in this Parliament is different from the proposition in front of MPs in Westminster, and I will go on to say a little bit more about that shortly. And that's why in our amendment, because of the economic shock of this change, we asked the Scottish Government to urgently and immediately apply the Barnett consequential funding it has not allocated to businesses so far. We are still dealing with uncertainty and fear. And so when I speak, as I do, to union representatives like those at factories such as Alexander Dennis in Falkirk, they do not know yet how they will be affected by the rules of origin requirements announced last week, and so whether tariffs may be triggered or not. And that is a sign of the scale of this economic, political and democratic crisis we are dealing with. There was no co-production here, no engagement with industry, and certainly no engagement with trade unions. And what is ironic is that one of the great criticisms of the European Union is that it lacks transparency and that its democracy was diffuse and flawed. Yet in place of a European Court of Justice that meets in public will be a dispute and arbitration council that meets in private. And our terms of leaving the EU, and so the terms of the most important treaty entered into in 50 years, is being rushed through with the force of Crown prerogative, crushing debate and guillotining democratic scrutiny. It is a democratic outrage. The motion in this Parliament quite rightly says that a no-deal outcome must be avoided at all costs. So I have to say this. A vote against the proposition in Westminster today is to risk the chaos and damage of a no-deal outcome. And you can't say, by voting against it, as SNP MPs will do today, that wasn't what we meant. That's what will happen, which is why Labour MPs will reluctantly vote for the deal, because the alternative would be chaos. But there is no reason why even an initial ratification could not be subject to the scrutiny it merits in both our parliamentary democracy, including in this Parliament, the Welsh Senate and the Northern Ireland Assembly, but outside in the country too. There are other things that concern me, that ought to concern us all. Fewer than 1 in 5 large businesses in Scotland today are now Scottish-owned. 82% are not. Over half of all businesses' turnover in Scotland is now generated by businesses with their ultimate base outside Scotland. Over a third of all workers are employed in these firms. That's nearly 700,000 jobs. Yes, I'll take.
Liz Davison.
Let's talk about the voice of business in Scotland. The head of the CBI in Scotland has said a negotiated deal between the UK and the EU brings with it a slew of immediate benefits. For starters, it will protect jobs under pressure from the pandemic via duty and quota-free trade. In short, the size of the prize is real. Ending years of division and delay by securing an agreement with the EU will help our economy during the biggest challenge of our generation. Does he accept that? And what on earth is his party in the Scottish Parliament playing at when his colleagues down south are at least doing the responsible thing?
Richard Leonard.
We're not playing anything. We're making a serious intervention in an important democratic debate, which is about the future of devolution, about the future of the Scottish economy and about the future of jobs and people's livelihoods. It's much higher. It's much higher, that exposure to internal investment and therefore internal potential disinvestment than other parts of the UK. And here we have in this treaty, which the Conservative Party sign and support, that guarantees the freedom of movement of capital, but does not guarantee the freedom of movement of people. In fact, when it comes to people, it is words like temporary, it is words like business visitors, it is independent professionals, and so an abrupt end to the opportunities to live and work across the continent for people. Erasmus is gone, ending opportunities for students to work and study across the continent. The commitments on labour and environmental standards are weak and considerably weaker than even the optimists expected. So we will support the motion today, just as we hope others will back our amendment. For us, the priority is dealing with these economic shocks, not detonating more, which the SNP has in mind. It is dealing with the national emergency before us in a spirit of cooperation and renewed determination. It is to seek to get powers repatriated from Europe to this Parliament, like unemployment law, health and safety, public procurement. That is the best way to defend democracy, and that is the best way to stand up for Scotland. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. Now we've moved the motion and the two amendments. I'm going to call Jill McAlpine to open for the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee before the other opening speakers.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee has scrutinised Brexit and its implications since 2016. We've listened to thousands of hours of oral evidence and received tens of thousands of pages of written evidence from concerned stakeholders. I thank all who have provided evidence, the members of the committee and our clerks and advisers for their hard work over the years. The process, which began in 2016, reached a culmination of sorts with the Trade and Cooperation Agreement of the 24th of December and the European Union Future Relationship Bill, which is passing through Westminster today. According to the bill's explanatory notes, 24 out of the 36 clauses engage the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament. Our committee is required to report on the bill and the legislative consent memorandum which the Scottish Government has produced. We have now done so, and our written response, published in the last hour, recommends the Scottish Parliament does not give the bill legislative consent for reasons that I will outline in my remarks today. The committee has had little time for scrutiny of the bill or the LCM. We took evidence from the Cabinet Secretary for Constitution, Europe and External Affairs this morning. We requested that the Chancellor of Duchy of Lancaster, the Right Honourable Michael Gove MP, give evidence to the committee for the UK Government, but his office said this was not possible. However, the committee 9 days ago published a report entitled EU-UK Government Future Relationship Negotiations, the Impact of the End of the Transition Period. And that work has helped inform our written response today, which was made in the last hour with only 2 Conservative members of the committee dissenting from the report. I'd like to thank our 2 advisers, Dr. Anna Jurjewska, a globally recognised customs and international trade advisor, and Dr. Fabian Zulig, Chief Executive and Chief Economist with the European Policy Centre. Their expertise and insight has been invaluable. The committee believes the timescales for consideration of this bill are completely unacceptable. To scrutinise the implications of the 24th December agreement in less than a week and to consider the UK bill and the content of an LCM in less than a day is clearly inadequate. This timetable exhibits disregard for parliamentary scrutiny and the role of all legislatures across the UK, and I note that the European Parliament refuses to be treated in this way and will not begin its scrutiny until January. The agreement itself is certainly unique. It is the first modern trade deal to disintegrate a trading partnership and erect barriers between markets. All other modern trade agreements seek to strengthen partnerships and dismantle barriers. Zero tariff and zero quota trade is not the same as seamless or frictionless trade. Leaving the single market and customs union means very significant non-tariff barriers will affect exporters on the 1st of January, just 2 days' time. The new relationship between the EU and UK will involve the reintroduction of customs procedures, border checks and sanitary and phytosanitary checks. Individuals wishing to work in the EU countries will be affected, while the mutual recognition of professional qualifications will effectively end. Even the removal of tariffs and quotas on goods is conditional on matters such as rules of origin regulations. This will have a significant impact on supply chains. Nor does the agreement address the delays, congestions and bottlenecks we see already at our ports. The agreement does not cover services, which account for 80% of UK GDP and 40% of UK exports to the EU. This includes financial services, a key sector of Scotland's economy. The UK and EU hope to reach a Memorandum of Understanding by March to recognise each other's financial regulations, a process known as equivalence. However, equivalence decisions granted by the EU can be withdrawn at short notice, as Switzerland has discovered in the past. This is a thin agreement, as many aspects of trade and cooperation have still to be negotiated and agreed. The committee believes that will result in, quote, a significantly negative economic impact to both the Scottish and UK economy. The committee is also concerned about the governance framework, which will oversee the implementation of the agreement. This is headed by a partnership council co-chaired by a representative from the European Commission and a UK government minister. Then 19 specialised committees and 4 working groups to deal with specific aspects of the EU-UK trading relationship. The committee notes that some of the subject matters considered within this government framework concerns devolved competences such as justice and fisheries. We are unaware of any provision for the Scottish Government to participate within this governance framework. We therefore recommend that the Scottish Government, at ministerial and official level as appropriate, should be present at meetings that deal with devolved policy areas. The governance framework also establishes a parliamentary partnership assembly consisting of members from European and UK parliaments. The committee recommends that the Scottish Parliament should be represented in that assembly. The committee notes the UK will be a third country in regards to law enforcement and judicial cooperation. We are very concerned that the UK will not be able to participate in the European Arrest Warrant Scheme or the Schengen Information Scheme. It's also a matter of deep regret that the UK will no longer participate in the Erasmus Plus programme. The committee in 2018 conducted an inquiry into Erasmus Plus, which found that Scotland benefited significantly from participation in this, and in particular, the committee found that young people from disadvantaged backgrounds found the scheme opened doors and transformed their life chances. We found it was much more than a university exchange programme, but benefited young people in further education, apprenticeships, in youth work and in volunteering. We therefore recommend that the Scottish Government explore all possible avenues to enable young people in Scotland to continue to participate in Erasmus+, and that the UK Government reconsider its rejection of the programme. In its inquiry into the future relationship negotiations, our committee took evidence from the Scottish fisheries sector, who were repeatedly told by the UK Government that Brexit would result in them having a significant increase in their quotas and complete control of their waters. Whether or not we consider that a realistic expectation, it is what they were promised, and the agreement falls far short of those promises. The committee is aware of the concern being expressed by fishing stakeholders and also by analysis that suggests Scottish fishermen will have their quotas of certain species reduced, and we would welcome further analysis into this matter. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, the Culture, Tourism, Europe and External Affairs Committee, with the exception of our 2 Conservative members, believe the European Union Future Relationship Bill will have significant negative consequences for the economy, society and culture of Scotland. The time given to this Parliament to scrutinise the agreement and the bill is completely inadequate. The committee therefore recommends that the Scottish Parliament does not provide legislative consent to the European Union Future Relationship Bill. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I call on Patrick Harvey to be followed by Willie Rennie.
This is a day of broken promises, but then it could never have been anything else. UK voters were promised all the benefits of EU membership and none of the costs. Today we see xenophobic British nationalists cheering as new barriers of bureaucracy are erected, as hard-won standards which protect us at work, in what we eat, and even in the air we breathe are put at risk, and as our family of nations is presented as rivals at a time when the world needs international cooperation more than ever. But in many ways, it's still something the Brexiteers campaigned for and did deliver, which pains me the most: the end of free movement. It was the issue which many on the Leave side were most motivated by. But of course, the referendum itself gave no mandate for it. If they'd wanted a referendum about how much they hate immigration, they should have printed that question on the ballot papers. They didn't. And of course, the politicians, their wealthy donors, tax dodgers and media owners who brought about the Brexit project, they won't lose their freedom of movement. They're just taking it away from those without their privileges. I still think it's the greatest tragedy, century after century, generation after generation, of young people from the countries of Europe being marched by their governments into fields and ditches to slaughter one another. In the last few decades, we've built institutions which give them a different future, which give them the ability to choose for themselves if they want to travel and where to live, to work, to study, to learn, to make a life. And it tears my heart out to see that fantastic opportunity being taken away from the next generation. It's a fundamental failure to recognise Europe's historic purpose as a peace project. I think it's ironic that the Conservative amendment today comes in the name of Ruth Davidson, who clearly, as part of her speech, believes that others should be held to their words. Because it was Ruth Davidson who, before the 2014 referendum, told me that I was being disingenuous for saying that voting no would put our place in Europe at risk. It was Ruth Davidson who, before the 2016 referendum, positioned herself as the challenger to everything Boris Johnson stood for. It was Ruth Davidson who, after the Brexit vote, said we should absolutely stay in the single market. And it's Ruth Davidson who has now accepted a peerage from that same hard-right populist Boris Johnson so that she never needs to face democratic accountability again. We should all be conscious of the undoubted social, economic and political harm that this deal will do. And I think it's worth noting that the Labour amendment acknowledges that the deal that their MPs at Westminster are backing does harm which will need to be mitigated. Do they really think, I would like to think in the words of their amendment, but do they really think that the UK will step up and start working together with us on workers' rights or environmental standards when they're voting against legislation here to do just that? Or that the UK government will U-turn on their perverse and vindictive decision to withdraw from Erasmus? I don't think so. And if the Labour Party do, if the Labour MPs do back this deal at Westminster, I think it's clear they will accept responsibility for it. But if the Scottish Labour Party here think that their amendment helps to cover their confused position somehow, I won't oppose it. We have all witnessed the Prime Minister's deliberate, and I think it is deliberate, dancing on the edge of a cliff. We're now seeing an agreement announced with no scrutiny, now a bill published on the same day as the legislative consent memorandum here is debated, with the UK government certain, absolutely certain, to ignore the consent decision that we make in this Parliament. This is a pathetic parody of scrutiny, but this, of course, is how the take-back control mob like to operate. Presiding Officer, I understand why some people just want all this to be over. In reality, the self-inflicted wound of Brexit will not stop getting worse just because this agreement is signed or put into law. The economic, social, environmental and political harm will continue. To some people, today marks the end of their long campaign of British exceptionalism, xenophobia, anti-immigrant rhetoric and free market deregulation extremism. To some people, it might feel like the end of a period of extraordinary chaos, incompetence and hubris in the governance of the UK. To me, Presiding Officer, this is not an end. In the long run, this moment will mark only a temporary interruption in our place in the European family. It's the beginning of a campaign to rejoin. Scotland's future is as part of our European family, and I hope the rest of the UK reaches that decision too someday. I even hope that Europe will have them back. And in the words of the pledge just launched by the European movement in Scotland, we declare that Scotland is a European country, embracing our common values of peace, democracy, human rights, equality, sustainability and solidarity. The clear wish of the great majority of the Scottish people is that Scotland should be within the European Union. We commit to working to bring this about, whatever Scotland's constitutional status. In short, Presiding Officer, we will be back.
Thank you. I call Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate needs a bit of realism. This deal is going through. It is going through because Boris Johnson has an 80-seat majority. He has his Eurosceptics on board, and even the bulk of the Labour Party is backing it. So no deal has finally been taken off the table. But just because we accept Brexit is happening, that there is a deal and that it is going through, does not mean we have to like it. We are realistic, but we won't swallow our deep reservations about Brexit, and especially this deal. In no way is anyone compelled to vote for something that they think will be bad for this country. And after all the Brexit chaos this Conservative government has inflicted on millions of people for years, and after the Scottish Conservatives promised they would never back a deal that gave separate treatment to Northern Ireland, that party is in no position to lecture anyone about Brexit today. There should be no surprise that Liberal Democrats can't support the Conservatives on Brexit today, because our support for Europe has been resolute for decades. From the Liberals, no. From the Liberals' support for yes in the 75 referendum, the Gang of Four in the 80s, Paddy Ashdown bailing out John Major to support the Maastricht Treaty in the 90s, to our enthusiastic support for Remain in 2016 and our advocacy for a people's vote for the last 4 years. People who believe in a strong relationship with Europe can count on us. We do not use Europe as a weapon in another battle to be discarded when no longer useful. We believe in international partnership and cooperation, especially with our closest neighbours. It is why we support keeping the UK together and believe the lessons from Brexit should be the lessons for those who advocate independence. This is a bad deal. The Prime Minister ran down the clock in the most cynical fashion to give parliamentarians just 3 working days to read, analyse, scrutinise and vote on 1,246 pages of complex legal text. This is not good government. Giving companies just a week to get ready is not good business. Where is the sensible easement arrangement? We will be the first country in the world to put trade barriers up as a result of a trade deal. The Prime Minister claims no quotas or tariffs on goods. But if the UK diverges, and that was the point of Brexit, was it not, there will be heavy, punitive tariffs and quotas. Those tariffs and quotas will hang around like a bad smell for years to come. There will be more paperwork, regulation and red tape. There is double regulation on health, safety and standards, like the REACH agreement, the Chemical Directive, on the recognition of qualifications and on the rules of origin. Why are there an estimated 400 million new forms for business if there is no additional paperwork? Why is the government recruiting 50,000 custom agents if there is no additional red tape? And why are there 23 separate new committees if the bureaucracy has been slashed. There is no agreement on services, not in financial, broadcasting, creative or legal industries, all world-leading for the UK. Without equivalence, these businesses will face a web of different rules across the EU. Most financial services have already found new homes in Paris and Frankfurt, while creatives look to Amsterdam and lawyers to Dublin. This, we will see, a slow erosion of service businesses' activity to the EU, rather than being exported from the UK. Where is the sea of opportunity on fish? The industry rightly feels duped. The deal takes back control of our waters before promptly handing it back to Europe again for 5.5 years at least. There is no Erasmus for students, no European arrest warrant to catch escaping criminals, no HEHIC health insurance card to protect us on holiday. The UK economy will suffer a slow puncture as companies make future investment decisions opting to work out of Europe rather than the UK. So what is going to replace it? All the UK's new trade deals with non-EU countries are simply copies of existing EU trade deals. So where is the advantage for the UK? Where is the opportunity? If the EU trade arrangements were holding us back, how does a copy of EU trade arrangements help us anymore? Yet we must look forward. Against this backdrop, the UK government must step up and explain how on earth it will create new jobs and opportunities, how it will engage with our neighbours in Europe, how it will work and trade with new countries. This country must be open, optimistic and engaging with the world. And the Liberal Democrats will work to make that a reality. But when our children look back at this time, they will be astonished that the UK government voluntarily pursued this big bang change in the middle of a global pandemic with the biggest economic and health crisis this country has ever faced. It is quite astonishing. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And we move to the open part of the debate. I call Bruce Crawford to be followed by Jamie Halker-Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, I'd sincerely hope that debate on a consent motion for an agreement of this type and nature would never actually be required. Perhaps naively on my part, believing that common sense would prevail. And at the very least, Scotland would remain in the single market and the customs union. And that the very precious fundamental principle of freedom of movement for peoples across the European continent could be retained. Now, I have no doubt, as we've heard already, to the fore in this debate on the Trade and Cooperation Agreement will be the deep impact on the economy and jobs. An agreement that will come into force in only less than 2 days' time. But we'll all have to live with economic consequences for decades. Greater hardship and many fewer opportunities will be the reality. As the UK Government's own Office for Budget Responsibility forecast, this type of agreement will reduce Britain's long-run GDP by 4%, unbelievably making the long-run costs of the pandemic look minor in comparison. Others will want to focus on the betrayal of Scotland's fishing communities, or the scandalous decision not to take part in the important Erasmus programme, which will have a real impact on our young people. Some too will wish to highlight the chameleon-like, ever-changing position of the Scottish Tories, as they seek to justify each new position adopted while the very sand runs out from underneath their feet. However, for me personally, it is the ending of the freedom of movement that brings the greatest concern, and yes, like Patrick Harvey, sadness. Any gains that might have been made from the taking back control, the deceitful campaign sloganised by the Leave campaign, will come at great cost to our personal freedoms. I've only got 4 minutes, and I've heard enough of Brexiteers for the rest of my life, frankly. Freedom of movement began as a way to encourage people to travel to fill jobs after the hell of the Second World War, and also crucially to discourage future conflict on the continent. Now, after 60 years, this freedom allows citizens to work, study and retire anywhere in the European Union, plus, of course, Norway, Liechtenstein and Iceland. The stark reality of taking back control is that our cherished freedoms are to be taken from us. That these hard-won fundamental freedoms can be so easily cast aside and forgotten fills me with despair. In all good conscience, for this reason alone, I could not support the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. In doing so, I would be taking ownership of an agreement that says to the young people in Scotland that I voted to restrict your freedom to travel, to restrict your freedom to work in any EU country, to restrict your freedom to reside in any EU country of your choice, and even to restrict your freedoms to study, start a business, or even fall in love. So too I am angry, because the agreement all too clearly demonstrates that the Tories are hell-bent on imposing their small-minded, inward-looking isolationism on a country that voted overwhelmingly to remain in the EU. An agreement that lays bare the lie that a no vote in September in 2014 meant Scotland would be an equal partner in the UK and in the EU. And yes, anger, despair and sadness, but real hope for the future too, because I know that I live in a Scotland that is outward-looking and international in its perspective. And that is why, Presiding Officer, in the second independence referendum that is undoubtedly coming, the progressive voices of hope and a belief that Scotland should take her responsibility as an independent nation will win the day. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
I call Jamie Halker-Johnson to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you. Can I remind the Chamber of my register of interest as a partner in a farming business and a member of a number of agricultural bodies. Presiding Officer, across the country there was an audible sigh of relief when news hit that a trade deal between the UK and the EU seemed to have been reached, and just 2 days out from Christmas. And as that news first dropped, Michael Russell was lecturing the Chamber on the dangers of no deal. The response from my colleague Dean Lockhart was prescient, asking if the SNP, despite their claims, would vote for or against the deal that they had previously held as so essential. Well, we now know, because they and the Liberal Democrats, and probably Scottish Labour too, although they may have changed their mind since the debate started, will all reject the deal. But I believe in cooperation and free trade with our closest neighbours, as do organisations like the CBI, the FSB, NFU, Scotland and many others who have welcomed news that an agreement has been reached. And it's a good deal for our agricultural sector. Tariff-free trade with benefit many, avoiding, for example, potentially sizeable tariffs for those of our farmers and crofters whose lamb is exported to the EU. The National Sheep Association has called upon us to celebrate the deal. It also addresses many of those non-tariff barriers which are just as important to businesses and exporters. And the EU recognises those key geographical indicators, like Scotch whisky and our Braith Smokies, that so underline the quality of our produce. Combined with the UK government's flexibilities on seasonal workers, the farming sector as a whole will end this year with far greater certainty than we entered it. Although, of course, Scotland's farmers and crofters are still waiting for SNP ministers to, and I quote, stop dithering and start delivering and come up with a clear agricultural policy for the future. And on fishing, the UK will be outside of the CFP as an independent coastal state for the first time in a generation, while our important seafood sector's abilities to continue to export to vital EU markets has been protected. And while I appreciate some will question the length of the proposed adjustment period, it is a huge progress from what the EU were initially demanding and will provide time to invest in our fishing communities, time to prepare infrastructure, rebuild our fleet and prepare for a bright future that lies ahead for Scottish fishermen, where our fishing sector grows on the back of increasing opportunities. A future so different from that offered by the SNP, back in the CFP, back under the control of Brussels. Many of this chamber voted to remain in the EU. I was one of them. But whatever view you take of the referendum in 2016, it's right that we move forward in a spirit of cooperation and partnership with the EU. And it's that question, not the one about whether or not you agree with the result of the referendum, which we face today. I also recognise that there are those in this chamber who voted leave. And if Alex Neil is to be believed, more on the SNP benches than will own up to it publicly. And that shouldn't be a surprise, because they would be representing the estimated 1/3 of SNP supporters who back Brexit, supporters whose opinion the SNP has totally ignored for 4 years. Presiding officer, it is entirely positive that we have before us a solid free trade agreement with our nearest neighbours and good friends in the European Union. Many said it cannot be done. Some, including the First Minister, even suggested that a no-deal outcome was what the UK government was seeking. But they were wrong. We will now have a period of stability in our relationship and an opportunity to rebuild our economy, focus on the NHS and continue to battle the COVID pandemic that has caused so much harm and suffering. Today's vote is not, as some will seek to present it, a vote on EU membership. We've been out of the EU for a year now, and voting to turn our backs on the EU would be a strange way to show support for it, because this is as much the EU's agreement as the UK's. There's been a compromise by both, but it is in the interests of both. And many in this chamber have claimed they oppose a no-deal outcome, but these words are meaningless if they choose not to vote for this deal. The time for the divisions between Remain and Leave are over. Now is the time to move forward together as a parliament and a country, and backing the deal today is that first step.
Thank you. Can I call Claire Adamson to be followed by Claire Baker? Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To make it perfectly clear, I say that it is not acceptable to me if the outcome of our exit from the European Union means that we can no longer participate in the Erasmus Plus programme. Not my words, although they could have been, but those of Jackson Carlaw in 2018. And in January last year, the Prime Minister said at Prime Minister's Question Time in the Parliament, there is no threat to the Erasmus scheme. So why does this betrayal matter? Established in 1987 under the stewardship of Dr Winnie Ewing when she chaired the European Parliament's Education and Culture Committee, it established, primarily for higher education students at that time, the programme. Erasmus Plus is now so much more. It helps further education, apprentices, youth groups, lifelong learners and educators take part in participation across Europe. On the radio this morning, Alistair Jack indicated that it was too expensive and it was elitist. But the words of the convener of our European and Culture Committee have shown us that our own Parliament's investigation into Erasmus highlights its benefits. Indeed, the European Commission 2019 impact study of the Erasmus programme highlights this too. States Erasmus and strategic partnerships facilitate social inclusion and reinforce democratic values. 3 in 5 projects are considered to have contributed to enhancing social inclusion and non-discrimination in higher education. And 56% of participating organisations state that the strategic partnerships reinforce democratic values and the civic role of universities in their countries. It goes on to talk about how important Erasmus is to the competencies of employment and social cohesion. It states that participants find it much easier to get jobs. 1 in 4 Erasmus students go on to train abroad following participation in the scheme. It has, no, sorry, I don't have enough time. The mobility of academics improves teaching, learning practices, staff skills and competencies. And for our education establishments, it highlighted that projects boost digitalisation and innovative pedagogies, how important at the time of a pandemic. It also enhances and strengthens innovation and entrepreneurship. All of these tangible benefits thrown away under the Tory Brexit bus, along with their extra monies for the NHS. But not so for Ireland. That small independent nation of the European Union will extend to Northern Ireland the benefits of Erasmus Plus even after Brexit. The country's Minister for Higher Education, Simon Harris, said, "It's not a cost, it's an investment." How very different it could have been for Scotland if our young people and the pleas for a differentiated settlement had not fallen on Westminster Tory deaf ears. Mr Jack says too expensive. I say an investment in our young people. And Ireland demonstrating values that reflect why the United Nations rank Ireland first for quality of life, while the UK languishes far, far behind many European neighbours. What a beacon of hope it would be for an independent Scotland. We have had taunts this afternoon in this chamber about whether this is a deal or no deal. Unfortunately for the Conservatives, the whole country knows that it's not deal or no deal. It's a game of jeopardy that they are complicit in, jeopardising the life chances of our young people, apprentices and youth groups, jeopardising 33 years of relationship building between Scotland's universities and the academia of our European neighbours, jeopardising the opportunities for collaboration and innovation, jeopardising social and cultural integration across Europe, and jeopardising the very recognition of professional qualifications across Europe in the middle of a pandemic. Boris Johnson promised a sea of opportunity for our fishing. He promised Erasmus Plus would be safe, and he also promised a bonfire of red tape. The only bonfire we have is that of broken Brexit promises, Presiding Officer, which I fear will be burning for a very long time.
Thank you. I call Claire Baker to be followed by Kenneth Gibson. Claire Baker.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. While the agreement reached between the UK Government and the EU inevitably comes with a sense of relief that the absolute chaos of a no-deal Brexit has been averted, the impact of leaving the European Union will be felt in communities across Scotland in the months and years to come. We have been unnecessarily taken to the cliff edge of no deal, which would be catastrophic for our economy, our international reputation and our future relationship with the EU. In the midst of the pandemic, there was a clear justification for an extended negotiation period, and there is still justification for a longer transmission period, as businesses are already facing a very difficult start to the year. As Deputy Convener of the Culture, Tourism and Europe and External Affairs Committee, I have heard a wealth of evidence from organisations across the country about the barriers, complexities and risks faced by businesses, academic institutions, public services and individuals as a result of Brexit. The deal we are faced with across the UK today leaves many unanswered questions about what the consequences will be. Whatever we decide in this Parliament today, Brexit will go ahead, and in all likelihood on the terms agreed in this deal. But today is an important opportunity for this Parliament to express its prevailing concerns. A legislative consent motion should be a substantive mechanism for dialogue between this Parliament and the UK Parliament, a focus for effective and inclusive dialogue between the governments of the UK. However, there has been little engagement or detail from UK ministers, not only on the negotiations, but on analysis of the potential impacts of Brexit and their approach to securing a deal with the European Union. Not only was there a lack of consultation with committees of the Parliament, but we've also heard evidence from Scottish ministers that there has been little effective dialogue at ministerial level. The approach adopted by the UK Government has, by accident or I suspect by design, failed to recognise or understand the role of devolved governments in Parliament, and the way in which this LCM has been introduced is a clear indication of that. There cannot be an MSP in the Chamber who doesn't envy the right of democratic scrutiny that's been protected for the European Parliament by applying the agreement on a provisional basis. Of the 36 clauses in the bill, 24 are relevant to the legislative competence of the Scottish Parliament, but we had no opportunity to consult, take evidence or effectively scrutinise. We should take our role as parliamentarians seriously, and the proposition before us today to accept changes to our devolved responsibilities with insufficient understanding of the consequences is unacceptable. This is not the question that has been asked at the UK Parliament today, and the consequences of the votes are not the same. While SNP MPs are prepared to vote against the bill at Westminster today, those who are taking the legislation seriously recognise that rejecting the legislation risks setting us on effectively a no-deal course, a chaotic exit with no statutory underpinning. This is a difficult decision being taken by Labour MPs, but it's been taken in the interest of businesses and communities right across the country. But we have a different proposition before us, and so, somewhat regrettably, it is not surprising that we and other devolved administrations and Parliament conclude that we cannot support the respective legislative consent motions. There is no doubt that many of our discussions in the remaining months of this Parliament and the next will be centred on the impact of Brexit and the deal which has been agreed, and these concerns weigh on many of us as we cast our votes today. The UK Government has done little to reach out to those who voted to remain in the European Union, and done less to involve the devolved parliaments in discussing the terms on which it will leave. So it should really come as no surprise to them today when Parliament rejects the LCM. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Baker. Can I call Kenneth Gibson to be followed by Liz Smith?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. So, all that for all that, the promised land is but 48 hours away. The UK's new awakening, free of Eurocrats and straight cucumbers. Or was that just a myth created by one Boris Johnson many moons ago? Still, we won't have to worry about EU citizens coming over here, picking our fruit and vegetables, processing our fish, caring for our old folk and working in our universities. Nah. And with control over our seas, Britannia rules the waves once more. Well, not in terms of fishing, obviously, as my colleague Stuart Stevenson will soon articulate. The Tories argue we should vote for this terrible deal on the basis it's better than none at all. By that logic, we should support any old rubbish. The difference between this cobbled-together deal and none is the difference between asked if you would prefer to be run over by a train or a lorry. I simply don't accept that. It seems that all Scotland deserves is a choice between a terrible deal we wouldn't vote for and no deal we didn't vote for. Even then, our view only counts if it's in accordance with Westminster. Whatever happened to Scotland leading rather than leaving the UK? Scotland, the Scottish Government and this Parliament have been repeatedly ignored or dismissed during this entire Brexit debacle. Our nation is surely worth more. We must have the right to determine Scotland's own future, including the choice of becoming an independent European nation. Meanwhile, businesses, their proprietors and employees bear the brunt of Tory incompetence. Only yesterday, the UK Government admitted there would be practical and procedural changes businesses must deal with when transition ends and some disruption as many businesses prepare for the added cost, bureaucracy and red tape of new customs procedures impacting in just 2 days. Some disruption is a blatant understatement. People travelling to the UK have been urged by the UK Government to make extra checks, including mobile phone roaming charges and extra insurance. And this is only the start. This Brexit deal is an act of economic vandalism during a global pandemic and will damage jobs, incomes, businesses and the economy. The Warwick study estimates the Scottish economy has already lost £3.94 billion by July 2020, and this deal could cost every Scot more than £1,600 annually by 2030 compared to EU membership, according to Scottish ministers. Scaremongering, the Tories may say, yet the Treasury estimates impact could be 1/3 higher. Industries and communities face higher prices and reduced access to EU markets. Our right to live, work and study across Europe stripped away. Justice and security cooperation diminished. The blame lies squarely with the Tories. SNP MSPs simply cannot support this damaging deal. We reject it on behalf of the Scottish people whose views have been ignored, who oppose this entire Brexit shambles, but have to accept whatever is imposed on Scotland regardless. Presiding Officer, there is limited provision for Scotland's crucial financial services in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. This sector will now be subject to a 30-day notice of withdrawal of equivalency, creating a level of uncertainty and risk to financial service providers forced to either maintain EU-authorised businesses and gear up operations on a member state basis or withdraw their services. This will result in a diminishing of Scottish operations, reduced employment, tax revenue and extra charges to firms of multiple authorisations and compliance. All goods sectors face higher costs of trading with the EU due to additional customs, borders procedures and paperwork, making businesses less competitive. Manufacturing, food and drink, agriculture and forestry are particularly at risk. And the seafood sector will require new certificates and changes to business practices. Justice and security cooperation will be seriously impacted, with Police Scotland less effective in fighting international crime gangs and people trafficking. Reduced EU migration will negatively impact our population, economy and culture, exacerbating labour shortages in health and social care, while it's not clear how access to Horizon will be delivered. It's a bad deal, and I ask colleagues to reject it and support the motion.
Thank you, Mr Gibson. Can I call Liz Smith to be followed by Alec Rowley?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sure I'm not alone in this chamber in having lost count of how many Brexit-related debates there have been in this chamber during the past 4 years. But what I do know is that at every turn, the SNP has argued vociferously over the dangers of no deal. The official record of this Parliament, some of which I read last night, is littered with SNP criticism of no deal because they said the outcome was too terrifying to contemplate. Indeed, they even tried engaging the lawyers to stop a no-deal Brexit. Yet this afternoon, when a deal is in front of them, they will reject it. And I will say, I won't if you don't mind. And I will say more about this in a minute. But before I do, Can I make it abundantly clear, and I entirely agree with my colleague Jamie Halcrow-Johnson, that whether we voted leave or remain is not the issue today. That decision, about which some of us in this chamber were disappointed, was made back in 2016. And the time to accept that verdict of the 2016 referendum was the day after the result. Politics had moved on, and for us, that meant every effort had to be made to secure a post-Brexit trade deal. Because the deal, I want, if you don't mind, Mr Harvey, because that deal was not only in the best interests of the UK and the EU in comparison to a no deal, but also in the best interests of Scotland. Indeed, when we debated the continuity bill many times in this chamber in recent months, virtually the only line of agreement between nationalist and unionist was that whatever post-Brexit structures are put in place, they have to be these supporting economic growth. And here is why. Because a post-Brexit trade deal is what the vast majority of businesses wanted, because it secured them the advantages in terms of jobs, in terms of trade, in terms of investment and economies of scale, all those factors which are so essential to economic growth and of course made even more important during a health pandemic, which has done so much to undermine our economic activity. Indeed, only yesterday, there were further warnings from economists that the pre-pandemic levels of GDP will not return until the end of 2022 at the earliest, and that is a very stark warning. To have ended up with a no deal would, I believe, have been much the worst outcome for us all, which is exactly why so many in the business community, the FSB, the CBI, the Chambers of Commerce, the NFUS, described the deal as a huge relief, because the basis of that deal secured is to protect UK and EU trade with exports and imports of £668 billion, whilst allowing the UK much more freedom to strike other trade deals, just as has been demonstrated in recent months. That deal has to mean the creation of new jobs, most especially green jobs, maintaining and enhancing high standards, whether in the field of environment or food, and a level playing field when it comes to the future trade negotiations within frameworks which are attractive to investment and new talent, alongside secured UK participation in EU science projects, Horizon Europe, Euratom and Copernicus, and mutual cooperation when it comes to security and law enforcement. Presiding Officer, let me return to the numerous debates in this chamber, during which time the SNP used every opportunity that they could to accuse these benches in particular of selling out Scotland. Worse than that in some cases, given the transcripts I was reading last night, the words treachery, disloyalty, hypocrisy, even some that, Presiding Officer, you ruled as unparliamentary language, were used against us. Now, however, after all that criticism, and I don't know how many times it happened, that a deal was better than no deal, we will find that they vote against the deal. But the truth is, Presiding Officer, that the SNP never wanted Brexit because they believed that it was the best way to secure independence. Well, Brexit has happened, and so has the deal. And on these benches, we will be supporting that deal because it is in the best interests of the UK, Europe and Scotland to do so.
Thank you, Mr Smith. I call Alec Rowley to be followed by Stuart Stevenson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The motion in front of us today calls on the UK Government to seek a pause in current implementation while special arrangements are made to take account of the difficulties for Scotland and for many others that will become apparent as the bill is more fully considered. I would suggest that it should give all of us concern that a bill that will cause severe damage to Scotland's environmental, economic and social interests is being given so little scrutiny. As we know in this Parliament, being asked to agree a legislative consent motion does not have a binding legal effect, and whether we agree or not, Boris Johnson and his cabinet of ideologues will proceed regardless, as long as they can secure a majority in Westminster. As such, we have no powers in this Parliament to either approve or to stop the trade deal being agreed by the UK and the EU. That is a matter for the Westminster Parliament. However, there does seem to be a general consensus, even in this Parliament, that a bad deal is better than a no deal. At a UK level, Keir Starmer has said the thin agreement does not do enough to protect jobs, to protect the environment and protect workers' rights. But as the only alternative at this stage would be a no-deal exit, then that would be even more damaging to the UK economy. So Labour at a UK level will not vote for a no-deal, given that it would be even more damaging for Scotland as well as the rest of the UK. Scottish Labour supports that position, and in this Parliament will use this symbolic vote of the LCM to highlight some wider issues. As the party of devolution, we would make the point that Boris Johnson and his cabal have, throughout the whole Brexit process, driven a cart and horses through the devolution settlement. And to all those die-hard unionists who think somehow this is clever, it is not, and it threatens the very fabric of the UK. And that is not in Scotland's interest either, for our largest trading partner is the rest of the United Kingdom. That is why I say again, the greatest threat to the future of the United Kingdom is Boris Johnson and his race-to-the-bottom Tory party. Given the fact that the LCM in this Parliament today is pretty meaningless, therefore, it must be considered a wake-up call for the desperate need to reform the devolution settlement. There is a growing movement for reform and change across the whole of the United Kingdom, in Wales, in Northern Ireland and in the regions of England, and we must use the experience of Brexit to build better government through the realisation of government which is closer to the people. But we can also make clear today that this Parliament demands a greater say in future trade deals, a greater say on how we can use state aid to build an industrial base for 21st century Scotland, and a greater say on how we rebuild our relationship with the rest of Europe, for we may have come out of the European Union, but we certainly have not come out of Europe. We must also make the case that our largest trading partner is the rest of the United Kingdom, and that is why reforming government across the whole of the United Kingdom is so crucial for Scotland in the 21st century. Presiding Officer, as we move forward and Brexit does happen, because the vote will happen in Westminster today, we must look forward to the type of Scotland that we want to see in the 21st century, the type of Scotland that can provide the jobs and the security for the people of Scotland. And that will be through enhancing the powers of this Parliament and stopping the threat to devolution that comes directly from the Tories and Boris Johnson. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Rowley. I call Stuart Stevenson to be followed by Graham Simpson.
On the 30th of September 1938, Neville Chamberlain came off a plane at Heston Airport in London after many days of fog. On the 24th of December 2020, Boris Johnson, like Neville Chamberlain, waved his bit of paper that represented the most gross and manifest capitulation to the interests of others. Neville Chamberlain, at least when he went to brief the monarch, was cheered along the Mall. It didn't last terribly long. Boris Johnson couldn't even arrange for a crowd to cheer this grubby little deal that we find ourselves debating today. Ruth Davidson has spoken to us about what she sees as the benefits of this, and she's spoken about the headlines. Well, the headlines may giveth, but the small print taketh away. I've had to double the size of the print because where fishing is concerned, the relevant numbers were in 5-point print. We've heard that 25% increase in quotas. There are 87 lines on pages 902 to 906 of the agreement. Each line a different stock, showing the outcomes between now and 2026 and beyond. it says. How many of those lines show an uplift of at least 25%? The answer is 4, madam. 4. Hake from the North Sea, hake from the Western, horse mackerel, Western, and Norway pout. Fish that are important to us, cod and haddock. The quota is going down. That is why skippers in the northeast of Scotland have been saying this is actually a worse deal than being in the common fisheries policy. Not a better deal. Now let's look at some of the other numbers on this. How many of the 87 lines of each quota, how many of them give the UK at least 50% of the catch? And the answer is, out of the 87, 25. 25. How many of these lines give us 100% of the catch, as we were promised as an independent coastal state? None. Not a single one. This is why across Europe there has been celebration, because the EU got everything it wanted. The Frankfurter Allgemeine quoted Douglas Adam in their headline yesterday, "So long and thanks for all the fish." And of course, those of you who've read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy will know that they posed to their most powerful computer, what is the answer to the most important question? And after 3 million years of computation, the computer came up with the answer, 42. And by coincidence, 29 lines of this particular sellout, brought to us courtesy of Boris Johnson, the man who is master of not a single dot, comma, or matter of detail. The answer is that only 29% of the lines take you to 42. So this is a shabby deal that has seen skippers, with a single exception that I've been able to find, condemn without reservation, this shabby deal that will see our fishermen in a worse place than they have been for decades, as well as seed potato merchants.
And I call Graham Simpson before we move to closing speakers. Graham Simpson.
Thank you. These debates, and as Liz Smith said, there have been many, have tended to be about how people voted in the referendum, and we've heard some of that today. But we've moved on from that. We have left the EU. We did that this January. Today's debate is about what happens next, what our trading relationship is to be with the EU, and what the terms will be. The question since January has been about whether we could negotiate a future trading relationship with the EU. And the Prime Minister's delivered. We could have been without a deal, but it's always got to be better to have a mutually acceptable deal than not. And Nicola Sturgeon has been saying that for months. She was right to do so, but I'm not sure she meant it, because for the SNP to now say that they won't back the deal, which has been passed, by the way, is tantamount to backing no deal. If they got their way, we would not have any deal from tomorrow onwards. And in the words of the First Minister, that could be catastrophic for both sides. But it's clear to me that the First Minister was repeating her mantra about no deal being bad because she believed that would be the outcome, and indeed wanted it to be the outcome. She hoped she could then use what she would describe as the ensuing chaos to push for independence. She thought, wrongly, that Boris Johnson would not be able to pull this deal off, or or that even wanted to. But she miscalculated. She misjudged the Prime Minister. And she also forgot that the EU always leaves things to the 11th hour. Boris Johnson has delivered on democracy, and she does not like it one bit. She doesn't like it. This is the first time the EU has ever done a deal allowing zero quotas and zero tariffs. That's historic. At midnight tomorrow, our fishermen will be able to catch more than before and will get government investment. We can do trade deals around the world. Liz Truss has been zooming around the globe doing just that. We can control our borders with a points-based immigration system, and all our laws will be made in our parliaments. So this historic agreement ends the EU state aid regime in Great Britain and allows us to introduce our own modern subsidy system. It ensures that each party will have in place its own independent system of subsidy control and that neither side is bound to follow the rules of the other. And that means we can better support businesses to grow and thrive in a way that best suits the interests of British and Scottish industries like BIFAB. The German columnist Alexander von Schoenberg said, "Your Prime Minister has achieved a deal which is nothing short of sensational, legally out of the EU, but with full economic access to it, which is the best possible news for the members of the EU too." So, Presiding Officer, if both sides like the deal, then what's not to like? The SNP's stance is nonsensical. Scottish Labour's is utterly bizarre. No deal Nicola has been exposed. Now, having been rumbled, Presiding Officer, she should do the right thing and put country before party.
Thank you, Mr Simpson. And we're now going to move to closing speeches. Can I call Alex Cole-Hamilton to be followed by Ross Greer?
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I rise to close for the Liberal Democrats and to restate the position of my party both in this Parliament and in Westminster. We have already voted against the Conservative government's Brexit strategy and trade deal in the House of Commons this afternoon, and we will vote to withhold our consent for it in this chamber this evening. But that is not an effort to manufacture grievance between the nations of these islands. We do not see this as a frontier in another constitutional debate, and at no point will we permit our vote against this deal to be used by the SNP to that end. Nor is it a tacit support for leaving the EU without a deal. You need only look at the history of my party and its efforts side by side with ardent Europeans to understand the measure of our commitment to the European project. Presiding Officer, I am a European to my fingertips. I joined my party in part because of its place in an international liberal movement that seeks to bring nations together. The European project is Union is a project for peace and for freedom that ended centuries of war. It says a lot that I am only the second generation in the recorded history of my entire family to never have to face conflict in continental Europe. I cannot believe that our country is turning its back on that. Presiding Officer, Liberal Democrats are heartbroken by this outcome, and we will not act as midwives to it. This deal sailed through the Commons this afternoon and by a country mile. No deal is off the table, and it will honour the will of those people who voted by majority for the UK to leave the European Union in 2016. I accept that result, but I will not be complicit in its execution. Since that day in June, over 4 years ago, my party has stood in the vanguard of those who have called for the British people to have the final say on this deal, to be asked in the quiet solemnity of the polling places where this first started, is this really what you meant? And we stand by that commitment. The British people will not be given a chance to render judgment on this deal, so we cannot presume to decide on its merits for them. Our votes against it and to withhold consent are not born of petulance, but out of a recognition for the mandate given to our party to fight for that final say and against this destructive enterprise. To the SNP, I say this. We may vote on similar lines both in Edinburgh and in London this evening, but we do so for very different reasons. Brexit is not a reason for independence. It is a warning against it. And Remainers will find you out. There is no viable path to European membership through independence which does not take an age or cause our people hardship. Instead, it will bring us more chaos, just at a time when people across this country are crying out for calm. All of the arguments that you have deployed against the UK's departure from the EU are applicable to Scotland's departure from the UK, and we will remind you of your words should that question arise again. Presiding Officer, we vote against this deal for the same reasons we will always vote against independence, because as Liberals, by definition, we are not nationalists. We could not willingly vote to make our constituents poorer or our country more isolated to satisfy romantic notions of statehood and of sovereignty. Instead, I will use all the time that I am given as a public servant to defend our membership of the Union of Nations we still have left to us, and to build the case over time for re-establishing our membership of the one that we have lost. Our vote this evening is entirely consistent with our position that we have held these last 4 years. We have never called for this deal, or for any other deal other than the one that we currently enjoy. Nothing about Brexit will improve the lives of the people we were sent here to serve, and as such, we want no part in it and its delivery, and will vote against it tonight.
Thank you. And I call Ross Greer to be followed by Anas Sarwar. Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's been interesting to watch two almost completely unrelated debates take place this afternoon. 4 of the 5 parties in this Parliament are, to a greater or lesser extent, debating the issue at hand, legislative consent for the enabling legislation surrounding the UK government's Brexit deal. But the Tories are stuck somewhere in, I think, 2019, arguing against a no-deal scenario which is no longer even possible. Of course, in 2019, they weren't the ones arguing against no deal. They were insisting that it would be better than a bad deal. Ruth Davidson may have made this accusation of others, but the mental gymnastics and rhetorical flourishes from the Scottish Tories over these last 4 years have been frankly incredible. It really wasn't all that long ago that the soon-to-be Baroness was previously and passionately advocating for the single market and customs union. And even more recently, Jackson Carlaw joined the rest of us in defending Scottish participation in the Erasmus Plus scheme. You've got to wonder, did the so-called moderate Tories realise that at some point between 2016 and now, they became advocates of an even more extreme Brexit than the one the duplicitous Vote Leave campaign advocated for during the referendum campaign itself? It's been addressed already repeatedly, but I want to say again that neither we nor members of the Welsh Senedd, Northern Irish Assembly or even the House of Commons are being asked to choose between this terrible deal and no deal. It's over. The Brexiteers won, and the UK government's executive powers under the royal prerogative mean the Brexit agreement will be ratified. No deal isn't on the table. It's no longer an option. Scotland will be dragged out of the EU against our democratic wishes on the basis of this deal. But beyond the point of technical fact, there's the political reality that the bill in the Commons today would have passed with Tory votes alone. Even if the UK Labour Party had taken a principled position rather than one of triangulation, it wouldn't have mattered. The Tories won the last election. This awful deal was negotiated by them, and it will be passed by them. They should own it. But of course, they don't want to own the consequences of their deal. They don't want to own the job losses to come. They don't want to own the loss of opportunities for our young people. And they certainly don't want to own the blow they've just struck against the service sector. The Scottish Greens opposed Brexit. We believe the UK was always better off in the European Union. And we have no doubt that Scotland's interests would be best served if our future is as an independent nation and a full EU member state. We look forward to that debate heading into next year's election. And we look forward to the majority now in favour of this country's independence, seeing their collective will realised as a result of the democratic mandate we will secure in May. Our objecting to granting legislative consent is based on more immediate concerns, though. The Brexit process has been used by the Westminster Government as an opportunity to directly attack the very principles of devolution and the authority of Scotland's Parliament. This was by no means an unavoidable consequence of Brexit. It's simply the one that the Tories have chosen. They are taking full advantage of a crisis of their own making, not to give back control to the British people, but to take it from them, and especially from the peoples of Scotland and Wales. Because that was the agenda all along. I have no doubt that many Leave voters made their choice out of a desire for some kind of strengthened popular sovereignty. But that was never the goal of the disaster capitalists driving the Leave campaign and who now drive this UK government. And they found that the price of acquiescence from their Scottish Tory colleagues was nothing more than a peerage. Today, this Parliament will withhold our consent from the Tories' bad deal and its consequences for Scotland. But we know the UK government will plough ahead regardless, driven as they have been for decades by a profound post-imperial identity crisis and the always enticing opportunity to cash in and profit at the expense of the people that they claim to represent. Scotland did not vote for this, not in the referendum or in any election since. If there's any upside to these last few days and these last few years, it is now the sustained majority in favour of independence. And on what is otherwise a day of great sadness, I, for one, am looking forward to the moment, coming soon, where Scotland takes its place amongst the European family of nations once again. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Nicole. Anas Sarwar to be followed by Dean Lockhart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Officer, where is the Ruth Davidson from Wembley Arena gone? The Ruth Davidson that was claiming to be the hero of that Brexit campaign. Where is her remorse? Where is her and the Tory bench's apology? 4 years of chaos, 4 years of deadlock, 4 years of division, and 4 years of destruction of our democratic processes. Where is that apology? Where is that remorse? In normal times, this would be an absolute disgrace. But let's not forget we're in the midst of a pandemic. Thousands of our citizens have lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands of people's livelihoods are still at risk. This is unforgivable. And the sad reality is, for the party that claims to be the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party, the sad reality is the biggest threat to the United Kingdom is Boris Johnson and this Conservative Party. This is a deal that is going to hammer Scotland and the rest of the UK. This is a deal that puts up barriers when the rest of the world is trying to break barriers down. This is a deal that ends the Erasmus programme, that gives our young people opportunity and outward-looking hope. This is a deal that impacts on our economy and on our jobs, and it's a deal that reduces our employment and environmental rights. And that's why we as a collective should be fighting together to protect those economic levers, to protect those employment rights and those environmental rights. And for that, I do thank the SNP for supporting our amendment. But I think we've also got to be honest that the choice in this Parliament is very different from the choice facing our colleagues in the UK Parliament, and it is wrong to suggest otherwise. I have seen some say that this is somehow us playing into the SNP's game. Are the Welsh Labour Party playing the SNP's game? Or are they standing up for devolution in Wales, like we are standing up for devolution in Scotland? This is about devolution, not the SNP. The SNP is not devolution. The Scottish Parliament is not the SNP. Regardless of which party is in power here, or indeed the Welsh Parliament, this would be an utter disgrace and an attack on the very principles of our devolution settlement. And I think it's important to get that point across. But it's also important to recognise that this is a very different choice. I want to quote the House of Commons Library directly, the equivalent of SPICE in this Parliament, independent researchers, to those that deny that there's a different choice in Westminster and a different choice here. I quote the House of Commons Library: "If the bill does not pass, the UK will be unable to agree to give the Trade and Cooperation Agreement provisional application, and the UK would exit the transition period with no deal. It is in the national interest to support the deal in order to stop no deal." And I support my colleague Ian Murray in that effort and pursuit today. Presiding Officer, the reality is the process of reaching this trade deal has been an utter shambles. The agreement falls far short of what the Tories promised and has failed to recognise the importance of devolved legislators, which is why Scottish and Welsh Labour colleagues are expressing our deep dissatisfaction with that process today. We have to stop no deal. The UK Parliament has a binary choice between a deal or no deal, and that's why Labour MPs are acting in the national interest, not the nationalist interest, to avoid a no-deal scenario, and the SNP cannot escape that reality. Today we are standing up for devolution and this Parliament, and stopping no deal in the UK Parliament. And it has to be said that today is about the Tories, their failures. They have to own that failure, but we should be in no doubt that you do not mitigate the impact of Brexit by multiplying its impact. This is not a game. It's certainly not a game between Brexit extremists or independence extremists. Brexit will have a devastating impact on the UK economy. It will have a devastating impact on living standards, and it will have a devastating impact on our standing in the wider world. But you do not beat division with more division. You don't defeat chaos with more chaos, and you don't defeat nationalism with more nationalism. Again, I remind members, we are in the midst of a pandemic. Thousands of our fellow citizens' lives are still at risk. Hundreds of thousands of our fellow citizens still risk losing their livelihoods. Let's end the division, chaos and the constitutional brinkmanship, and let's instead resolve to make it our collective national mission to come through this pandemic and rebuild after COVID.
Thank you. I call on Dean Lockhart to be followed by the Cabinet Secretary.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. The SNP's approach to this debate has been to avoid the fundamental question that sits before this chamber today. That question is whether we want to leave the European Union with the benefits of a comprehensive deal, or we want to leave without a deal. There is no third option, either here at Westminster or in the European Union. It is deal or no deal. A straight choice between voting for the most comprehensive free trade agreement the EU has ever entered into, a deal covering £660 billion of trade between the UK and the EU, a deal our European friends have described as fair and balanced, and as Graham Simpson pointed out, a sensational deal, a deal that gives the UK full economic access to the European Union. Or the other option is to join No Deal Nicola and Cliff Edge Mike in voting against the deal, and in doing so support a no-deal Brexit. Something my colleagues have reminded the First Minister she said would be a catastrophe, because in her words, a deal, any deal, is better than no deal. But that's exactly what the SNP will be doing today. They'll vote for a no-deal Brexit, because the SNP know deep down, despite all their spin, that this deal is a good outcome for Scotland, but a bad outcome. It's a bad outcome for their politics of division and their attempts to drive a wedge between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Presiding Officer, it's a good deal because it delivers historic opportunities for Scotland. As Ruth Davidson highlighted, it delivers tariff-free trade, quota-free access to the EU single market, the first time the EU has ever agreed such a deal. An outcome the SNP itself called for in its Scotland's Place in Europe publication 3 years ago. And an outcome, as my colleagues have said, welcomed by business organisations across Scotland and the UK. First, I will go through the benefits of the deal. It might be worth listening. It might change your vote at decision time. For Scotch whisky, Presiding Officer, we will now be able to resolve the US tariffs imposed as a result of the Airbus-Boeing dispute, a dispute that has seen sales of Scotch whisky to the US decline by 30% this year. On environmental and other standards, the deal will recognise the highest standards in domestic law, but also allow those standards to be tailored to the particular needs of Scotland, with over 110 new powers coming to this Parliament, powers the SNP immediately want to hand back to Brussels. And as Graham Simpson points out, from tomorrow night we will be able to shape our immigration policy to meet the needs of our economy. A new freedom vitally important to support jobs and livelihoods impacted by the COVID pandemic. Jamie Halcrow-Johnson highlighted that the deal allows us to shape agricultural policy for the needs of Scottish farmers, free of the shackles of the Common Agricultural Policy, with the NFUS saying it is good news that this deal has been done. Presiding Officer, this is a deal that works for Scotland's business communities, farmers, distillers, and for our scientists, manufacturers, exporters and the financial services sector. It's a deal the SNP said would not be possible. I will in a second. An outcome they call a thin deal, which is precisely the opposite of how our European friends are describing it, and a deal they will vote against today, making them the party of no-deal Brexit. I'll give way.
Stuart McMillan.
I thank Dean Lockhart for taking the intervention. He listed a number of organisations and individuals who he thinks this deal will benefit. But what about younger people who are now going to be stopped from taking part in the Erasmus scheme?
Dean Lockhart.
Well, the UK Government has announced a comprehensive scheme to replace that, the Turing scheme, which will be, and here's the point he talks about, directed towards students from a disadvantaged background, covering a comprehensive range of institutions with around 35,000 students being able to participate. Presiding Officer, this deal not only secures our future trade with Europe, it also frees up Scotland to expand trade across the globe. Scotland's trade with the rest of the world beyond Europe is already 50% more valuable than our trade with the EU single market. And countries across the world, including Japan, Singapore and Canada, have been queuing up to enter into free trade agreements with the UK. Important deals that will increase Scotland's exports, support jobs and livelihoods. But remarkably, the SNP has failed to support every single one of those deals. Refused to support the FTA with Singapore, the third largest market for Scotch whisky, with Japan, the fourth largest market for Scotch whisky, and refused to support deals with Canada, South Africa and a host of other countries, all rejected by the SNP. An extraordinary 15-year track record voting against every single free trade deal they had the opportunity to vote on, undermining Scottish jobs and livelihoods that depend on access to those markets. That's a track record, Presiding Officer, that shows deep down, despite all their spin, the SNP doesn't really care about trade, and that their political priorities over Brexit is nothing about trade. It's about the politics of division, and it's about their desire to drive a wedge between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Presiding Officer, in the first assessment of the economic impact of the deal, the Centre for Economics and Business Research has reported the following. The UK has once again this year become the world's fifth largest economy. In the next decade, the UK is set to outperform every EU economy apart from Germany, and over the next 15 years, the UK economy will be 25% larger than France. And unlike the SNP, we want Scotland to share in this remarkable growth and expand our trade with the rest of the UK, a market that already represents more than 60% of our business. But this will only be possible if we put the constitutional divisions of the past behind us and work together across the four nations of the UK. And that's why, Presiding Officer, last week we voted against the SNP's Continuity Bill, a bill that will create major trade barriers between Scotland and the rest of the UK. Legislation supported by Labour and the Liberal Democrats, showing once again they cannot be trusted with the Union. Presiding Officer, the choice in this chamber this afternoon is simple: to vote for a no-deal Brexit and continue the constitutional divisions of the past, which is exactly what the SNP wants to do, or to vote for this historic comprehensive free trade agreement and avoid a no-deal Brexit, leaving the divisions of the past behind us and work together in the years ahead to rebuild our communities after the COVID pandemic. And, Presiding Officer, that's exactly what we will be voting for at decision time this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Mr Lockhart. And can I ask Cabinet Secretary Michael Russell to conclude our debate?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I just at the outset quote the two leading experts on the constitution of trading deals who write in a blog for the London School of Economics, and I quote, "It has been suggested that a failure to vote in favour of the Brexit deal is a vote for a no deal. Such a suggestion is, from a legal and constitutional perspective, entirely wrong. Similarly, a vote in favour of the bill is not a vote in favour of the deal. It is simply a vote to give the executive the powers set out in the deal." So this is we have heard from the Tories this afternoon an entire afternoon of nonsense. It is constitutionally and legally untrue. So now we've dispensed with that, let's deal with the real subject at issue today. And the real subject at issue today is the change that will take place tomorrow at 11 p.m. between what we as citizens of Europe enjoy and what we will fail to have at 1 minute past 11. Now, that is the argument that Jamie Halcrow-Johnson this morning in the committee tried to avoid. It is the argument that Ruth Davidson tried to avoid, but that is the issue today. It is what we will lose. I spent 4.5 years on the issue of Brexit, and I regard today actually as a very sad day, because the Scottish Government has worked hard to try and achieve a compromise. We've had 28 meetings of JMC, and I have to say many of them have been appalling. We've had committees, letters, publications. We've gone the extra mile. And at the end of the day, tomorrow at 11 p.m, we will have to admit defeat on that matter. Temporarily, but it will be defeat, because we have not been able to stop this monumental act of self-harm. And we should stand back for a moment and look at the bigger picture here. And I was very taken both by the contribution from Patrick Harvie and from Bruce Crawford, because the bigger picture is both how we got here and our young people and where they go from here. And Patrick Harvie talked about the role of the EU as a peaceful and peacemaking organisation. And I must have spoken hundreds of times around Scotland about Brexit over the last 4.5 years. And it's a story that from time to time I would tell, and it's a very personal story, and I want to tell it here because it means a great deal to me. And it was brought on, my memory of it was brought on by a speech I heard in Berlin, and I can tell you the day, on the 17th of November 2016, from Martin Schulz, who was then President of the European Parliament. And he talked in a very moving way at a dinner that I was at in Berlin about the way in which the Second World War had damaged his family, created absolute chaos within his family, and a number of members had died and some had been wounded. But he pointed out the extraordinary nature of what happened next, because the victor nations reached out their hand to the vanquished nation and said, never again. Never again on this continent will this happen. And that was a remarkable and unique thing. And I was very struck at that moment by something in my own history. My father volunteered at the age of 19 for the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. He was on the beach in Dunkirk when he was wounded through the knee at the age of 20. And he was carried off the beach in Dunkirk. Now, what would it have been like for a 20-year-old young man on the beach in Dunkirk, brought up in the Douce Wee tune of Troon? What would it have been like? What terror he must have felt. How he must have wondered if he would live or die, if he would ever see his own country again. But he did. He lived, though he had that wound for the rest of his life. But that never happened to me when I was 20. And it never happened to my son when he was 20. And if it is only for that reason, that I regard the EU as something to remain within, then I will argue for that forever. Forever. And that is the issue that we address today. Because the issue is, what happens tomorrow at 11 p.m? What is the comparison between what we have now and what we lose? And the first thing we lose is that intangible. It is the belief that peace and prosperity comes from the work of sovereign nations who freely pool part of their sovereignty in order to work together. That is what we will lose, or what the United Kingdom will lose, for no good reason, except prejudice fueled by tabloid newspapers, pandered to by the pandered to by the Conservatives, and aided and abetted by the Conservative members in this chamber. And that is the shame they should feel. If this deal was really so good, why are the Conservatives so keen to blame all those who will not vote for it? Surely they would want to take this deal to themselves and claim all the credit for it. But the truth is that this deal is a very bad deal. And they have sought to hide it under the economic effects of COVID. And they want now to move on from it, to persuade us all to forget about it, to talk in some artificial language of unity, and to believe that we will simply accept what has taken place. Well, I won't accept it, because I won't give up on that intangible. And many people in Scotland will not accept it, because they will look at this set of circumstances and say a number of things. They will say, first of all, they have not been told the truth. They will say that the people who have persuaded them to follow this deal themselves did not believe in this deal. And they will say they have taken an opportunity, such an opportunity, from our young people. There's been lots of quoting, presiding officer, of people who spoke in this debate or that debate about this matter. let me quote Miles Briggs, who spoke in the same debate that I spoke in on the 28th of June 2016, the first debate after the vote. He said, "Our young people take an international view. We need to make sure that they have the opportunity to study, work and travel that they had before." I don't think Miles Briggs is a bad person. I don't think many of the people on the Tory benches are bad people. But good people can be tainted by bad actions. They can be tainted by making promises which they not only failed to keep, but they actually even undermined the things they had, like the Erasmus scheme. No, I'm sorry, I'm not going to. They can be tainted by arguing for a no deal, and then pretending that they did not do so. They can be tainted, particularly tainted, by failing to lift a finger to help those people who will be so badly affected. The fishermen, the farmers, the exporters, our young people, those who defend our law and order, even the Arbroath Smoky. Because we heard about the Arbroath Smoky this afternoon, but the reality is there is no new legal protection for geographic indicators, none in this deal. So even the one thing that was quoted as the advantage of the deal, I don't want to talk down the Arbroath Smoky. I'm conscious the member representing Arbroath Smokies is here in the chamber. But it is significant that the one thing that was claimed as a victory turned out not to be a victory. Presiding Officer, we should all be saddened by today. We've heard this ridiculous defence of the deal from the Conservatives, this ridiculous and threadbare defence. But it is not over. It is not over. I spoke in that debate on the 28th of June, and I talked about what had made us European. And we are European not because of a treaty that we signed 50 years ago, nor do we stop being European because of a treaty that somebody else signed today. It's not half a century of EU membership that's made us European. It is centuries of engagement. We were European before we were British. We sent students to the continent. We shared citizenship with France. We appealed our very nationhood to Rome. Wine was being shipped to my constituency, Loch Fyne, in the 15th century. In war and in peace, in Ancogi Nanshi, we looked to Europe, and they looked to us, in Voltaire's words, for our very idea of civilization. So we have an existential choice again. We have a choice whether we can call ourselves European, or we have to narrow our horizons in the way that the Scottish Conservatives, to their shame, are telling us to narrow them. Well, I won't narrow my horizons. I am European, and I will remain European. I am European even if I didn't choose to be so. And in time, this country, Scotland, will return to membership of the EU. And in so doing, we will simply make the choice we have made for centuries. And what we will remember is those people who tried to stop us making that choice. That is a foolish thing to do, because even the Scottish Conservatives cannot stand against the will of the Scottish people.
Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, colleagues. That concludes our debate on trade and cooperation agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union, and we're going to move straight to the question. The first question is that Amendment 23815.2, in the name of Ruth Davidson, which seeks to amend Motion 23815 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on trade and cooperation agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union be agreed. Are we all agreed? We're not agreed. We're going to move to a vote, and to do so, I'm going to suspend Parliament for a few moments to allow members to access the voting app, both members in the chamber and those online. The chamber is suspended. Thank you, colleagues. We are now back in session. So the question is that Amendment 23815.2 in the name of Ruth Davidson, which seeks to amend motion 23815 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon on trade and cooperation agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union be agreed. Members should cast their votes now. 1 minute division, the amendment in the name of Ruth Davidson. Thank you. That vote is now closed. If any members have had any difficulty voting, please let me know, either by raising a point of order in the chamber or online. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendment number 23815.2 in the name of Ruth Davidson is yes 30, no 94. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that amendment 23815.3 in the name of Richard Leonard, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Nicola Sturgeon, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. This is a 1 minute division on the amendment in the name of Richard Leonard. That vote is now closed. If members have had any difficulty voting, please let me know, either through points of order or online. Thank you. The result of that vote on amendment number 23815.3 in the name of Richard Leonard is yes 94, no 30. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. The next question is that motion 23815 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon as amended on trade and cooperation agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union be agreed. Are we all agreed? Or not agreed? We'll move to division. Members may cast their votes now. Thank you. That vote is now closed. Please let me know if you have had any difficulties in voting. Thank you, Ms Hislop. Thank you, Ms Hislop. That will be noted. You would have voted in favour and that will be added to the register.
Presiding Officer, I haven't got a confirmation I voted, but I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Mr Russell. I'll just check. I can confirm that your vote was already counted, Mr Russell. Thank you. Point of order, Aileen Campbell.
Hi, Presiding Officer, my app didn't activate and I wasn't able to vote, but I would have voted yes.
Thank you, Ms Campbell. That vote will be added to the register. Thank you very much. Right. Okay, that's fine. Can I confirm to Margaret Mitchell that her vote was registered? No need for a point of order. Your vote was registered. And Mr. Mark MacDonald, your vote also was registered. No need for a point of order. Mark MacDonald. Thank you. The result of the vote on motion 23815 in the name of Nicola Sturgeon as amended is yes 92. There were 30 votes against. There was 1 abstention. The motion as amended is therefore agreed.